In May 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of a nation facing its darkest hour. 5 years later, he was being cheered by millions, honoured across the world, his name synonymous with victory, the most successful wartime leader in British history. That is how many in the modern day remember him. Yet for most of the preceding 2 decades, Churchill had been a political outcast. His career had been declared dead not once, but repeatedly, buried first by a military catastrophe, then by a decade of isolation in which his own party refused to listen to him. In his moment of triumph, he was met by a crushing electoral rejection delivered by the very people he had led to victory. That he is remembered as a giant of history at all is not the result of a steady rise, but of a series of improbable reprieves. This is the story of 4 reasons why Winston Churchill came closer to being forgotten than most people realize. Reason 1. Gallipoli. The first reason Churchill nearly vanished from history can be linked to a single word: Gallipoli. In 1915, as First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill championed a daring naval assault on the Dardanelles Strait, intended to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the First World War and open a supply route to Russia. The plan was bold. The execution was disastrous. The naval attack failed to break through. When Allied troops landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, they met fierce Ottoman resistance and became trapped on the beaches. After 8 months of grinding stalemate, the campaign was abandoned. There were 250,000 Allied casualties, and the campaign achieved none of its strategic objectives. Churchill was forced to resign from the Admiralty in disgrace. The press called it Churchill's folly. For years afterwards, the mere mention of Gallipoli was enough to destroy his credibility in any military or political discussion. He had been one of the most promising figures in British politics. Now, he was the man who had sent tens of thousands to die for nothing. It is important to remember that Churchill was not solely responsible. The failures were shared across military command and the cabinet. However, the political damage settled squarely on him. A career that had seemed destined for the highest office was suddenly, at the age of 40, fighting for survival. Reason 2. The wilderness years. The second reason is the decade Churchill spent in what historians now call his wilderness years. The period from 1929 to 1939, when he held no government position and was regarded by many as a spent force. After the Conservative Party's election defeat in 1929, Churchill found himself increasingly isolated. He broke with the party leadership over 2 issues. First, he fiercely opposed Indian self-government, a position that made him seem an imperial relic at a time when the empire was moving towards reform. Second, and more fatefully, he began warning with growing urgency about the danger posed by Nazi Germany. At the time, neither position was popular. His stance on India alienated moderates. His warnings about Hitler and German rearmament were dismissed as alarmism by a public desperate to avoid another war. Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain, the dominant conservative figures of the period, deliberately excluded him from government. Chamberlain became Prime Minister in 1937 and pointedly kept Churchill on the backbenches. For a full decade, Churchill was a voice in the wilderness, speaking, writing, warning, but largely ignored. He was seen as a warmonger, a political opportunist, a man whose judgment could not be trusted. The Gallipoli stain had never fully lifted, and now his own party treated him as an irrelevance. Without the specific crisis that followed, he would almost certainly have ended his career as a colourful but failed politician, remembered, if at all, as the man who lost the Dardanelles and spent the 1930s shouting about a war nobody wanted. Enjoying the video? Please like and subscribe to support the channel. Let me know in the comments what you think Churchill's most problematic trait was. Reason 3. His own character. The third reason Churchill nearly vanished was Churchill himself. Throughout his career, Churchill repeatedly made decisions that alienated the people whose support he needed most. He switched parties twice, from conservative to liberal and back again, earning a lasting reputation as an opportunist. His opposition to Indian self-government made him appear a reactionary imperialist at a time when the empire was visibly moving towards reform. Even his allies found him difficult. Lord Beaverbrook once remarked that Churchill's greatest weakness was that he was always right at the wrong time. Within his own government during the war, senior figures regarded him as erratic, impulsive, and exhausting. His cabinet secretary noted that Churchill could generate more ideas in an hour than any other man, and often more bad ideas than good ones. He demanded absolute loyalty but gave it inconsistently in return. These traits were not minor quirks, they were career-threatening liabilities. The Gallipoli stain was political. The wilderness years were circumstantial. But the consistent pattern of self-sabotage, the refusal to moderate, the inability to read a room, the conviction that he was right even when everyone else disagreed, ran deeper than any single event. It was woven into who he was, and yet the paradox is inescapable. The very qualities that made him insufferable in peacetime were the ones that saved Britain in war. The stubbornness that destroyed his peacetime career was the resolve that refused to negotiate with Hitler. The refusal to follow consensus was the reason he had been warning about Germany when almost no one else would listen. The same character that repeatedly placed him on the edge of political oblivion is also the reason his name endures. The tension between those two facts sits at the heart of Churchill's legacy, and it makes what happened next all the more striking. Reason 4. Failing to win the peace. The fourth reason Churchill came close to being forgotten is that in victory his political fortunes changed course. In July 1945, 2 months after the Allied victory in Europe, Churchill went to the country in a general election. He was the hero of the war, the man whose speeches had held the nation together through the Blitz, whose face was recognized and revered across the free world. Victory seemed inevitable. Instead, the Conservative Party suffered one of the most decisive defeats in British electoral history. Labour, led by Clement Attlee, won 393 seats to the Conservatives' 197, a swing of over 10%. Churchill was out. Attlee moved into Downing Street. The British people had made a distinction that Churchill never fully accepted. They trusted him to win a war, but not to build a peace. The electorate wanted housing, healthcare, and a welfare state. Churchill campaigned on warnings about socialism and the Gestapo, a tone that struck voters as wildly out of touch after 6 years of collective sacrifice. At 70 years old, having delivered the greatest military victory in British history, Churchill was dismissed by the very people he had led. He did return to Downing Street 6 years later, winning the 1951 election at the age of 76. But the second premiership was not the triumphant final act it might have been. Churchill was elderly, often unwell, and increasingly detached from the day-to-day business of government. He suffered a severe stroke in 1953 that was concealed from the public and even from cabinet colleagues. His great project as peacetime Prime Minister, a summit between the great powers to ease Cold War tensions, never materialized. Foreign policy crises in Kenya, Malaya, and Egypt revealed an empire still managed by imperial instincts that felt increasingly out of step with the post-war world. He clung to office until 1955, when mounting pressure from within his own party finally forced his resignation, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. The war leader who had saved Britain from its darkest hour had failed to define its peacetime future. His legacy was secured by 1940, but his political career ended not with a roar, but with a slow, reluctant retreat. The verdict. The periods that could have reduced Winston Churchill's prominence can be summarized into the following 4 points. 1. The Gallipoli disaster of 1915 destroyed his military and political credibility, branding him as reckless for a generation. 2. The wilderness years from 1929 to 1939 saw him excluded from government, ignored by his own party, and dismissed as a warmongering has-been. 3. His own character, stubborn, contrarian, and often intolerable, repeatedly alienated the very people whose support he needed, even as those same qualities made him indispensable in crisis. 4. He failed to win the peace. Rejected by the electorate in 1945 at the moment of his greatest triumph, then unable to define a lasting peacetime legacy during a diminished and troubled second premiership. Without the specific convergence of the Second World War and the collapse of appeasement, Winston Churchill would likely be remembered as an interesting footnote, a brilliant but erratic politician who peaked too early, talked too much, and died in political obscurity. That he became instead one of the defining figures of the 20th century is not simply a matter of greatness. It is a matter of near miraculous timing, and the uncomfortable truth that the very qualities that saved him also repeatedly threatened to undo him. As for some of the more controversial sides of his legacy, that is for another video. Be sure to check out these recent videos, and thank you for supporting the channel.